Yeah, we moved from Thousand Oaks to the city of Downey, my wife, Chris, and I. It was 2 years ago in June. At that point, it was, we have the two of us, we had a baby daughter, and in the 2 years since then, we've added 2 more kids. And so we have 3 under 3, and all 5 of us are here and dressed. And so, yeah, we just need to kind of like celebrate that, and anything you get beyond that is, it's gravy. So we started Imago Day Church, like I said, which means image of God. We're in Southeast LA, the city of Downey. Southeast LA as a region is home to about 2 million people. Our church, we're actually a mostly Hispanic church in a mostly Hispanic context. We've been around for a year and a half. And in that year and a half, we've bounced 8 different locations. We've met in museums and restaurants and schools and art galleries, and we just last month signed a 1-year lease to be, yes, this is like huge, guys, where we will be in one location at least for the next year, and so we'll see beyond that. But it's been incredible, and it's given us a chance as a church to really breathe and to really dream, okay, now that we've kind of fought our way through, it was a struggle. We fought our way through this first year, and a community was formed, and people came to know Jesus. Where are we going from here? And it's really exciting. And one of the things that really excites me is to give you guys an update as a church of what God has been doing through us is we've been seeing the gospel take root in our community life. And one of the signs that the gospel of Jesus is really taking root in someone's life is when they confess sin. Right? Because who does that? Right? Like, why would you willingly be like, hey, just so you know, here's the worst part about me, right? You just throw that out there for everyone to see, but it's because there's a trust in the community. There's a trust that Jesus saves and forgives and cleanses, and a desire to know and be known. And when that's at work, you see that happen. And whenever it happens, it's kind of weird because I get excited about it. And so I'm like half crying with someone as they're sharing their book, and I'm also smiling, and they're like, what's wrong with you? And it's just this really cool thing. And I share that because we had someone in our community, it's one of the signs of gospel work in our area. Someone confessed sin to their, what we call the missional communities. It's groups that meet for dinner each week. And he confessed stuff that had been going on in his life. And I won't put him on blast and share everything, but I want to share what he said, because part of what he shared, it wasn't actions. He didn't do any like grave misdeed, but there was an attitude in his heart that as I share this, I want us to listen, because I think it's going to help us when we dive into our passage. So his story, this guy who shared, is he grew up, broken family, poverty, involved in gangs, and when he was in his 20s, Jesus came, interrupted his life, gave his life to Jesus, got saved, and what happened from there is he began to follow him and God's power at work in his life. And part of his discipleship to Jesus, part of the way maturity was working its way out in his life, is that he learned, okay, I'm going to keep this job that I'm in, and I'm going to marry my girl, and I'm going to like be present in this family, and as he's done that now for a few years, he's gotten promotions, and he moved out of the area that he was in, and he's kind of grown in honestly some real material ways, and with that he's gone from here to here. And he starts the conversations with him. He's always scheming about what he's going to be doing with money, and he's always thinking about what, status, and he's always thinking about the stuff and the cars and all, and you start hearing that in his conversations. And what's really tough is we're talking to him and trying to point out to him, hey man, like we're noticing this in your life, in your heart. It's really hard for him to see, because so much of his growth has been tied into making these advances. Does that make sense? So like he's been growing, and now we're trying to point, he's got this kind of blind spot, because he's looking around and he's like, look, we're making close to 6 figures. My kids aren't in gangs. I'm thinking about buying a house. Like, I'm part of this really cool church. Like, I'm here. Like, I'm doing good. What are you talking about? And I took a conversation this past week with his wife, where his wife just kind of laid out, and Spirit of God convicted him, broke him. He came and confessed his community group, his attitude and his heart. It was really beautiful. But I bring that to us to say this. He was relying on his past experience. He was relying on his material blessing, and he was relying on his proximity, his association with the people of God as his status before God. So when he was evaluating the state of his heart, he was looking at what had happened in the past. He was looking at what was around him, and he was looking at the community he was a part of, and he's saying, I'm good. All the while, his heart was hardened and far from him. And I want to ask us, I want us to examine this same thing. Is this at work in us, both as a church and as individuals? Like, where does your hope lie? When you're evaluating your relationship with God, as you're sitting there and saying, where am I standing before him? How does this relationship formed and what's fastening it together? What are the things that we communicate? What are the things that we believe are making that happen? Where is our confidence placed? And as we're teaching through the Gospel of Matthew, you guys have been watching God's kingdom in action. You've been seeing Jesus is this rightful king and the blessings that come when he heals and all the promises of the kingdom and all this cool stuff. And you're like, yes, but what does it mean to really be a part of that kingdom? What is our foundation? What is our relationship to the king and to his kingdom? What I want us to see, here's kind of a preview of where we're going. I desperately want us to see that it's by grace alone. Grace alone, that's our hope. The glory of God's kingdom and all the blessing that's bound up and all the things that he gives and all this, it's through grace. And participation in what God has for us is not rooted in our reputation. It's not rooted in what happened in the past. It's not rooted in anything else but our faith in the person of Jesus. And I want us to celebrate Jesus today, okay? So if you have a Bible, and if you don't, there's Bibles in the aisle. And we'll also have verses up on the screen. But if you have a Bible, I'd love if you'd open to the Gospel of Matthew. It's the first book of the New Testament. And we're in chapter 15. And before we read our passage that we're in today, I want to bring back the passage from last week. In the previous week, Jesus is talking, he's interacting with this group of people called the Pharisees. Pharisees are community religious leaders who are kind of influencing the broader community in how they relate to God and what their hopes are for the kingdom of God. And Jesus lays into them. Look at what he says. This is verse 7. He says, "You hypocrites. Well did Isaiah prophesy of you when he said, 'This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me.'" That's what I was talking about. You say the right thing, but a heart that doesn't desire God. In vain, this is hard stuff, Jesus says. In vain do they worship me. It's worthless. That's what vain means. Because they teach as doctrines the commandments of men. And he goes on to specify what he means. He says, listen, verse 11, "It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but what comes out of the mouth. This defiles someone." Because they're saying, here's what it means to be clean. Here's what it means to be right before God. Here's what it means that we're basing our foundation of our hope in. He's saying, listen, you don't understand what it means to be clean. You're doing all these religious activities, but at the bottom of it all, your heart is filthy. In verse 19, he says, "Because out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false witness, this attitude, slander. And these are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile anyone." So he lays into the Pharisees and their whole foundation of what they were teaching. He's saying, you think you know what it means to be clean and right before God, but you have no idea. And the very next passage, which is our passage, Jesus encounters a woman. And through this encounter, it's going to illustrate exactly what Jesus means and exactly what Jesus is looking for when it comes to having a heart that is right before God. So let's read our passage. I'm beginning in chapter 15, verse 21. And I want us to have this conversation about vain worship, honoring God with our lips, but our hearts far from him, and uncleanliness. I want to have that in our head as we read this. Verse 21. "And Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon." So real quick, this area, Tyre and Sidon, this is, he stepped out of Jewish kind of land and he's stepping into what's called Gentile or foreign, the nations, the unclean space. So Jesus is stepping into an unclean space right now. And he encounters, verse 22, behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out. So a Canaanite woman, that's a woman who's non-Jewish, not part of the people of God. If you read the Old Testament, the Canaanites are often those who make themselves, like, even in war, enemies of the people of Israel. And so, unclean person. And she's crying out, saying, have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon. Unclean space, unclean person, unclean spirit. Just like that, right? That's who he encounters off the bat. And she's crying out for mercy, and Jesus, verse 23, does something very surprising. He doesn't heal. Verse 23, he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, send her away, for she is crying out after us. They're saying, just deal with her and let her go. She's kind of annoying. She's following us around. She's bugging us. Like, just help her out maybe or whatever. Just get her out of our hair. We don't want to deal with this unclean person. And he answered this. He said, verse 24, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. His comment is he's saying, this is my mission. This is what I'm about. I have a purpose. You don't get confused. You've seen me heal. You've seen me teach, do all these things. But my mission, if I'm keeping the main thing, the reason why I'm here, Jesus is saying, is I'm not here just to be like a traveling doctor, right? Going around, here you go, here you go. No, I have a purpose, and more specifically, I have a people that God has called me to. Right? God has made promises that he's fulfilling throughout history, promises to this one people group, this one nation, and I am called to be their king and to send and to call them back. And I'm fulfilling God's purposes here. I cannot get distracted from what God has called me to. I've lost sheep. This is my mission. And yet she persists. Verse 25. She came and she knelt before him, saying, Lord, help me. She kneels. The picture here is they're walking along and she's kind of tagging along, crying out, help me, mercy. And kind of maybe they're annoyed by her. And then as he says this, it's like she runs in front on her knees, Lord, have mercy. And then Jesus says something that is going to offend us a bit. Verse 26. And he answered, it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. That's not nice and cuddly Jesus. We read that, we're like, Jesus, tone it down a bit, right? And what he's doing is he's giving a parable. It's a one-sentence parable. A parable is like a teaching in a picture. And the picture is this. It's a mom or a father or someone, making dinner and then coming, and the kids are hungry. They're the lost sheep. The kids are hungry, and making the dinner and saying, oh, you're hungry, and saying, you know what? No, I'm going to give it to the dog instead. And so the picture is, it's insulting a little bit. If this will help us get over the hurdle of what he says. He's not saying this to curse her or just straight up insult her. He's giving this picture of his purpose. Here's what I'm here for, and I can't be distracted from this purpose. But just because he's not insulting her doesn't mean it's not offensive. Because he's very clearly saying, I'm not here for you, I'm here for them. Right? And watch her response. This is incredible. Because she doesn't make a case. She doesn't take offense. In fact, she might even need some self-esteem training or something based on what she says in verse 27. She said, yes, Lord. Yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. She says, that's okay. I want the scraps, Jesus. And Jesus' response reveals his true heart, right? That what he's been doing has been testing and being kind of, it's been a front, so to speak. And as she says this, his heart is revealed. God's heart is revealed in what Jesus says. Verse 28, oh woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire, and her daughter was healed instantly. She experiences God's kingdom power in her life. Now, what I want us to do is if we can keep our context in mind here, this conversation that he just had with the religious teachers were about cleanliness and vain worship, right? And then he runs into this woman who's unclean, unclean, unclean. That's the billboard that's shining over her head. And he says, nah, I didn't come for you, which is the expected and typical response is sort of what he's giving. I didn't come for you. I'm not for you. You're not part of this promise. You're not part of what God's doing here. He gives what would kind of be the expected Jewish response from the Pharisees, but she shows faith, 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 and Jesus marvels. His heart is revealed. He heals, he blesses, and provides. And if you take these two passages together, it illustrates what he was teaching before, that faith and obedience is what draws God's heart far more than association or proximity is. That faith is what draws God's heart rather than dead tradition. And for us, before we move on, I want to speak to us, Anthem Church, right here. Because you're it's tough to find a bigger fan of Anthem Church than me. I got the tattoo, I've got the bumper sticker. I don't have the bumper sticker. You guys literally have them. Can I get one? Okay. I'm a huge fan of Anthem Church. I think this is a healthy body. I think love what God's doing here. But I want to ask us, I want to question this. Being a part of this community and being in Thousand Oaks, which is a beautiful city, right? It really is. And being a part of this area and all the blessings that come here, does your proximity to blessing, does your proximity to a good church, does all these things, does it lead you to a broken neediness before God? Will you say that characterizes your heart? Or is there an assumption that because I've got blessing, because I'm part of a good church, then I'm good then? Because what Jesus reveals right here is that nearness, proximity, doesn't mean jack. It's faith in Jesus. That's what matters. That's essential. Because we speak his name, we sing his songs, right? But without active faith, without ugly dependence on Jesus. Right? That's what this is. If you look at this woman, no one wants to be in her position, right? It's pitiable, it's embarrassing, and she's crying out, it's uncomfortable even. But without ugly dependence on Jesus, all our theology is worthless. Without ugly dependence on Jesus, all of our theology is worthless because broken and needy faith is what draws out God's heart and his attention. And it's not just in this passage. This is the theme of the whole scriptures. You don't have to turn there. I'll just read for you. This is Psalm 32. It says this, "Behold, the eye of the Lord is on those who fear him." So the eye of the Lord, what draws God's attention is those who fear him, on those who hope, who long for his steadfast love, that he may deliver their soul from death and keep them alive in famine. That's what draws his attention. Isaiah 66, I'll read the second part of this verse. "But this is the one to whom I will look." When the Bible says that, we should I want to pay attention to this, right? God's saying, this is what draws my attention. This is who I will look to. And we all are okay, cool, what is it? What is it? It's this. He who is humble and contrite or broken in spirit, who trembles at my word. And we see this in this woman as she's broken and needy before Jesus. And if we know the story, we know how could he possibly look away? And he doesn't. And what he seems to be saying is that she has what they should have had. And from there, God's grace is unleashed. He goes throughout the area. We know from the book of Mark, which tells the same story, that he goes from here and he remains in Gentile territory. Gentile, again, means foreigner, outsider, the nations, the unclean area. He remains in that area, and look at what he does, verse 29. "He went on from there and walked beside the Sea of Galilee. And he went up from the mountain and sat down there, and great crowds came to him, bringing with them the lame, the blind, the crippled, the mute, and many others. And they put him at his feet, and he healed them. So that the crowd wondered when they saw the mute speaking, the crippled healthy, the lame walking, and the blind seeing. And these Gentiles, they glorified the God of Israel." And then he goes and he repeats a miracle that he had done before. Feeding a large crowd, verse 32, he called his disciples to him and said, "I have compassion on this crowd. They've been with me now for 3 days and they have nothing to eat. I'm unwilling to send them away. lest they faint on the way. And the disciples said to him, where are we going to get enough bread to feed in such a desolate place to feed so great a crowd? And Jesus said to them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7 and a few small fish. And directing the crowd to sit down on the ground, he took the 7 loaves and the fish, and having given thanks, he broke them and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds, and they all ate and were satisfied. Even so, they took up 7 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. Those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. After sending them away, the crowds, he got into a boat and went to the region of Magadan. There's some who might say that this is the same occurrence, but it's 2 different moments. In Matthew 14, he feeds 5,000. In Matthew 15, he feeds 4,000. And the significance, the difference is that he feeds this time Gentiles. He feeds people who aren't a part of this covenant community. He goes outside the borders to bring blessing. God's kingdom blessings are overflowing from the borders, and this is wild, unclean foreigners are calling Jesus Messiah and glorifying the God of Israel. And if we take this all together, these 3 things of the woman and then the healing all these people and then the 4,000 that he feeds, if we take this all together in relationship to that previous passage about what defiles a person, we find that the Pharisees who were speaking, their problem, this is really important, their problem was not that they overestimated sin and didn't give any grace. That's kind of sometimes our picture of religion. When we think of hard religious rules, we think, man, they make too big a deal about sin and they don't have any grace. No, the reality is they underestimated how deep sin goes, and so they saw little need for grace. They didn't overstate sin with no grace. They underestimated how deep it really goes. They thought, no, we got this together, and so they didn't see that they were desperate for grace. But in these Gentile, unclean people, whatever, you find that they are coming before Jesus desperate and broken, and God's heart is revealed and his power unleashed. And in this picture of a woman who never makes a case, she doesn't lawyer up, right? She humiliates herself, casts herself before Jesus. Her only hope is his mercy. Her only hope is grace, and we see God's lavish mercy, right? So our question that we started off with, we considered this proximity that we have. We look at our blessings in life and we look at what God's done in the past, and we said, okay, are we counting on these things? Are these forming the foundation for our relationship with God? What is our hope? What is our foundation today and for the rest of our lives? What is it that draws us near to God? What is it? And the answer is faith in the grace of Jesus, right? Desperate faith that God is merciful and gracious. That's our hope. That's our bedrock. That's our foundation. Not my reputation, not my position or my job title, not my church that I'm a part of, right? Not my family and how great they are, not what I present on social media to the world, right? No, it's God's lavish grace. That's my hope. That's what I'm setting my life on. That's what I'm about. And if that's true, if that's our only hope, then I want to give Anthem Church, I want to give kind of 2 calls for you guys, right? I want to call this church, and I want to call you as an individual to 2 things. And the first is this. If grace is our answer, then the first thing is this, that grace calls us to a dependence on God's provision rather than on our strategy. Grace calls you to a life that is sustained by God's provision, not your strategy. We see that in this story, that the bread goes to the Jews first and then the Gentile, right? That's what he says to her. It's what we see literally in feeds the 5,000, then he feeds the 4,000. But in every story that we encounter, there's always enough bread, right? No one is outside the good news of Jesus. No one is outside the good news of Jesus. Send them away, the disciples said about the crowds. They look and they see, we can't deal with this. You need to send them away. This is a desolate place. They're looking, they're like, there's rocks and like a tumbleweed or, and there's like, there's nothing here. It's wilderness. We can't do anything about this. And Jesus says, well, how many loaves you got? What? I mean, we got like 7 loaves, bro. Like, what are we going to do with this? Because all they see is what they see. All they know is the limitation, right? Even though they've spent time with Jesus, all they see is these rocks and this wasteland. And I want to call us as a church and say that's our life too. All we see is what we see. All we see is what we know. We need the eyes of faith because there's a ministry that Jesus calls us to. There's a life and a relationship that he's calling us to. There's a pressing forward that he wants to do in your life. But all we see is like the neighborhood that you grew up in. Or all you see is the things that you did when you were 19, right? Or the family that you grew up in. Or you see your parents' failure or your financial situation. All you see is your sin. All you see is your fear. And as you look around, it's a wasteland, right? And you're like, I don't have anything to give. I'm sorry. I'm broken. And Jesus, verse 35, it says he took the 7 loaves and the fish, he gives them, he broke them, gave thanks, and he fills, and they're satisfied. We need to see Jesus and his ability to provide. They were satisfied, not just a little. The picture here, I want us to see the picture of this feeding that he does for these foreign people. The picture here is it's a party. It's a banquet. There's baskets overflowing. He sets a table in the wilderness. And as he does this, for the Jewish readers who are reading this story, it would call to mind a psalm, which I'll read for you. This is Psalm 78. If you want to turn there, you can. Psalm 78. It's a well-known song that they would sing, recalling all that God has done. I'm going to start in verse 12. It's a song that tells all that God has done in their past. In the sight of their fathers, God performed wonders. In the land of Egypt, in the fields of Zoan, he divided the sea and let them pass through it, and made the waters stand like a heap. That's the Red Sea in Exodus 15. In the daytime, he led them with a cloud, and all the night with a fiery light. He split rocks in the wilderness and gave them drink abundantly as from the deep. He made streams come out of the rock and caused waters to flow down like rivers. All these things that God has done. Verse 17. Yet they sinned still more against him, rebelling against the Most High in the desert. They tested God in their heart by demanding the food they craved. As they're out there in the wilderness, they spoke against God, saying, can God spread a table in the wilderness? It's this age-old problem that people have always had. There's a story of God's mighty acts in the past. And maybe we have a past experience with God, but in the present, do we trust him for this moment? Yeah, but can God provide here? Right? And Jesus, Matthew is showing us, and will continue to show us, and the New Testament will continue to show us, that Jesus is God's once and forever answer to that question. Can God provide? God has provided his very self. Jesus is God's means. He is God's promise fulfilled. If Jesus is all you have, he is all you will ever need. All that you need is in Jesus. And this story ends with this powerful picture of 7 baskets of overflowing pieces of bread. It begins with just 7 loaves, and it ends with 7 baskets overflowing. It shows God is capable of providing abundantly and more than we ever could ask or think, right? More and beyond his power and his grace. And it's never dependent on the circumstances that you see. It's dependent on the man of Jesus. And that's what that woman understood, right? It's that desperate faith because Jesus was there. And so there was no obstacle in front of her, no pride, nothing that would get in her way from saying, no, you are here, you have what I need, and I don't care about anything else. It's you and you alone. If I have you, I've got all that I need. This is my hope for my provision. And so, church, what is it that you are setting your hope, setting your eyes on? I want to call you to a life that is sustained by God's provision, not your strategy. A life that is sustained by God's grace, not your greatness. Because what happens is when we get in a hole, right? We've all been there, and we're lacking something, whether it's a financial resource type thing, or something bad happens, or there's a relational break, or morally there's sin, and we recognize the lack that's in our own hearts as we look and see the way that we're living. Maybe physically you're sick. You come into contact with these things, and then what happens? We start scheming, right? We start planning, strategizing. Maybe we stop giving. We stop showing up to community group. We don't have the relationship that we hoped for and longed for, and so we run outside of what God has said is good and right. We do this. But if we're dependent on God's grace, dependent on his provision, then we have all that we need in him. And this is the gospel life, because what happens then, this is where the gospel power really transforms us. Because when you encounter your lack, when you encounter your sin, when you encounter your broken bank account, when you encounter you see people who are better than you, right? You're like, man, that person's better than me, right? And you run into all these things, and there's voices from outside and inside that are like, you're not good enough. Well, there's a religious way of life, a Pharisaical way of life that says, no, you're not. You suck. Stop it. Get better. Right? Do this, do that. You're like, okay, right? Or maybe on the other side, there's sort of like a pop, pseudo-spiritual version of Christianity that says like, yes, you are good enough. You know, you're the unicorn in God's kingdom of rainbows. You're the best, you know? And it's like, okay. And we sort of like, yeah, that's cool. And it's like eating cotton candy. It's fluff, but there's no substance there. But the gospel power says this. It says, no, you're not good enough. You are lacking. You are broken. There is sin. You can't do it on your own, but that's okay because we're not doing your thing. We're doing my thing, right? My grace, my love, my power, it's on display even in your weakness. Maybe your weakness is even part of the point. Your lack is a place for me to show my glory. Be dependent on me and find life there. This is the point of tension for us. Because there's this promise that's laid in there, right? But we don't want to be dependent, right? We'd rather be offended, right? We'd rather do our own thing. But if we would let down our pride, we would be surprised by the lavishness of his grace, the lavishness of his provision. And so the second thing I want to call us to, the first thing is that we are sustained by his provision, not by our strategy. But if that's the case, if we're going to trust his provision, if we're going to trust his grace, then grace requires, this is the second thing, grace requires a humble posture. A humble posture. Give me the scraps. Humility in faith is saying this: God, I will take the least that you have for me as long as it's from you. God, I will take the least that you have for me as long as it's from you. Because Jesus, your worst is better than my best. Jesus, your worst is better than my best. And until you get to that point where you're able to say that, then you're always going to be scheming. You're always going to be strategizing. You're always going to be working in your flesh, thinking you can fix it, you can make it better, you know better, and you'll keep coming up empty. Jesus, I'll take your least over my best. Would God be so gracious to us as to make us needy? Would God be so kind to us as to make us poor? Because the blessing in your life is bound up with your dependence on Jesus. Let me say that again. The blessing in your life is bound up, it's tied up with your dependency on Jesus. Those two things are related. The blessed life is the desperate for grace life. Because the thing is, as we see, is that God doesn't give scraps, right? He gives grace upon grace, lavish and bountiful and full. He never gives his least. And the irony at the heart of this passage is that this unclean woman who doesn't belong, who's not, this unclean woman is the picture of faith. And he's saying, hey, you want to honor God. You want your worship to not be in vain, look like her. But what do you see when you look at her? Like, honestly, like, we don't want that. It's ugly, it's pitiable. You have pity on her, which is fine. We feel good about ourselves when we have pity on other people. We don't want people to have pity on us, right? It's embarrassing, it's humiliating. You're laid bare. It's embarrassing, but don't despise your weakness. Look to Jesus. Don't lose faith in the wilderness because he can create a feast even there. In fact, rather than pity or shame, as we look to this woman and we see, it should unleash in us joy. So that's the weird part about being a Christian, a follower of Jesus, is that not only is confession part of it, but it's a joyous confession. When we bring to light all the junk that's in our hearts, when we bring to light all our needs, when we bring to light all the stuff that's not right? There's actually a joy in that because we have a God who is gracious down in his core and loves to show his power at work in our weakness. And what it means is that anyone, right, can experience God's salvation because no one is hopeless. And I say that because as we come together, right, on a Sunday, we gather and we're carrying with us baggage. It's unseen, right? We all wearing nice clothes. We put on, we got baggage. And we got things going on in our hearts, in our lives, things we don't want anyone to know, things that are caving in on us, causing us anxiety, sleepless nights, all these things. We're breaking it, and he's saying, hey, no one is hopeless because it's not based on your greatness, but on his grace. And that the desperate life is the blessed life. And the call is to come and be like this woman and say, hey, Jesus, Lord, Son of David, it's you. I need your mercy. And if we would give ourselves to trust his provision and in humility say, I'll take your least over my best, I need you, we would experience, right, a deep assurance, a deep revival of what he has for us. We would have all that we need. Because we stretch this story out, we see that in the deepest place of our neediness, right, in the wilderness of our hearts, where sin and death reigned, God has prepared a table. This is what we celebrate when we do communion, which we're going to do in just a little bit. Jesus is the bread of life. And as we come into contact with his death and resurrection, as we come into contact with his grace, even in the most desperate and forlorn places, God is able to bring victory even there. His body broken for us is our means of salvation. Through Jesus, we're forgiven and made new. If anyone is in Christ, he is a new creation. So our faith is in Jesus alone. And this is, church, incredibly countercultural. I don't want to make any mistake about what I'm presenting to us. And incredibly counter Thousand Oaks. Incredibly counter this community. He's saying life is found in your ugliness. Life is found through his grace, which means humility and dependence. And many of us have worked our lives so that we wouldn't be dependent. Worked our lives so that we could put on a presentation of the good life. We've worked our lives for this end, and the gospel is calling us back to say, I'm broken, I'm needy, and the promise is that in this very place, God's heart is revealed and his blessing poured out, even to the foreigner and the outsider. No one is outside his grace. This is our call. And that's, I can speak that, but this is the end of my words because it's so countercultural. The Holy Spirit of God needs to work this in our hearts. And so what I want to do is I want to pray for you. I want to pray for myself. I want to pray for us that God would take this radical truth and reorient us, bring us to joy when we're needy. Bring us to joy when we're broken because his grace is sufficient for us. Let me pray for you. Father, lift up our eyes. Expose the ways, all the false ways that we evaluate our hearts, all the false ways that we evaluate our lives. Expose the way we're trusting in things that we've done in the past or even just the good church that we're a part of. Whatever, all these things, God, expose them. And God, make us needy and desperate. Not in a religious, overbearing way, because we can't fix it. In a way that makes us desperate for grace. And God, would we experience the lavishness of your love? That your heart and your eye is drawn to the needy. So God, banish pride in us. Give us the scraps. God, I'll take the least of what you have to offer. If you're all we have, you're all we need. God, would you be enough? Would Jesus be sufficient for Anthem Church? Spirit, would you speak to those of us who are in desperate financial situations? There are those of us who are secret and hidden sin. There are those of us carrying anxiety and depression. Draw us out, God. Put your grace on display through our weakness. And Jesus, this is faith. Would you be enough for us? Would you be enough for me? And God, would no one in this room, no one in Thousand Oaks, no one in our community feel that they are outside your power, that somehow they have transgressed too far, that they are forlorn and forgotten. No one is hopeless. No one is beyond your grace and provision. You create tables in the wilderness. You create life from the grave. You love the worst of sinners. So would we find rest and life in you? I pray this in Jesus' name.